we'll start. We're on time, so thank you very much for coming. Very excited to be here, particularly excited driving up this morning to hear the breakfast show with Zoe Ball. She said if you're in the potato business, you've got to be in Harrogate for the next 2 days. So we had a shout out on Radio 2 breakfast. So we're in the place to be. Well, we know we're in the industry to be. So I'm Cedric Porter. I'm the editor of World Potato Markets, and we could just have a look at some of the trends, some of the production we think this year, and some of the trends and things that are happening as well. And I'm going to present, and I'm going to be joined for a discussion with Gerard Croft, the Secretary of the British Potato Trade Association, and Roman Vorss from Euorpatat, which is the European Potato Association, which BPTA is a member of. So get your questions ready for that. If you can all see these screens, so that's what we're doing. Discussion. Get your questions ready. So World Potato Markets is a weekly newsletter looking at the global potato market in terms of price, production, trade, all over the world. And UK obviously is a major part of that, both as a producer but also as a buyer of potatoes from around the world. It's been a difficult year. I don't need to tell you that. I was just sort of totting up the seasons that we've had. And this is the third out of 6 seasons where we've had a significant weather event that we would probably only think was once in 20, 30, 40, 50 years, with droughts in 2018 and then in 2022, and then of course the weather situation in this year. And there was also it was very wet in 2019 as well, wasn't it? So all these issues that we've had to contend with. So what does that actually mean in production terms? It's a little bit difficult, and having lost the AHDB figures, always a guide, but I think they were a useful guide. So I've done some sort of number crunching in terms of that. You can all sort of see those figures there. And I think this is in terms of, this is the potato area and average yield. And I think we're looking at probably at least a sort of 5% reduction on last year, and perhaps a 10%. A lot of people sort of saying 10% in area terms. So I think we can definitely say that we had round about 2015 was quite a small planted area, but 2023 probably the smallest planted area ever. So we were starting from a pretty small base anyway in terms of what we'd planted. Only around about 100,000 hectares. These are actually figures for the whole of the UK. So these include Northern Ireland as well, which the old AHDB figures didn't. They were just GB, but this is the UK too. And then that's the yield figures there in this the blue line there. And really, we haven't seen any yield growth. Actually, if you look at it on a linear line, it's holding steady at best and maybe going down a little bit in terms of yield. So let's then just look at what we probably thought what the yield was this year and what the production is this year. And on my calculations, we probably, or could well have had the smallest crop ever. So these figures go right back to 1973. This is about as far back as you can go using DEFRA figures, and they show. So obviously we had who remembers 1976? Hands up. There's a few hands going up. I remember it being very hot, and I remember even then as a sort of 9-year-old being told about potato prices rocketing. So we had those two very, very small harvests back in 75 and 76. And then, of course, 2012 is who remember, well, more of us remember 2012, when that was a very wet year as well. But I think this year, the small area and then the wet crop that we've had as well means that we probably have had our smallest potato crop ever, at around about 4.2 million tonnes. If you go back, you don't have to go back too far, and you were well over 6 million tonnes. We had a peak of about nearly 8 million tonnes back in 1992. when the price obviously went down as well. But even up until 2017, we were well over 6 million tonnes that year. So we've lost a lot of production, and that is not just because of the weather. That is because of a reduced area. And, is that a concern for us? It's certainly a concern for us in terms of our self-sufficiency in potatoes. Just looking at some of using the 2020 figures as a base, the figures there from the AHDB, these are GB figures, so not UK figures, and just really bringing those forward, and what are we doing by sector? I think there's been a greater reduction in the pre-pack area, and there's been a greater production in seed and process and chipping and the bagged sector. So not such a decline in the processed area, but overall we've gone from having about an area of just in GB of around about 117,000 hectares to round about the 100,000 hectares, maybe slightly more if you put in Northern Ireland. And so that's been very much sort of focused on seed, and you see that with the Scottish seed areas figures this year. They are under 10,000 hectares for the first time since the records began. So a pressure there, and then so is that seed available for next year? That's another issue. In Europe, what's been the situation as well? They've had the same sort of rain, and that's been an enormous impact there as well. So some estimates in Belgium, more than 20% of the crop still in the ground. I know in Ireland it's probably around about half, 40% in the ground still to lift, and not being lifted anytime soon. So this is a Europe-wide or Northern Europe-wide issue. If you go further south, Spain, Portugal, they've been affected by droughts this year again. So again, that sort of resilience in terms of being hit by the weather. This is some DEFRA figures, and again, with the blue line there is my estimates on the sort of value of potato production in the UK, and so I think that a tight market often puts the price up. So you are going to probably see a higher price, although we're still quite reliant on contracts. Contracts around about 90% for processing, less with pre-packs, but probably around about sort of 70-75% of the national crop is contracted. But you will see an increase in value because of the higher prices for those potatoes that are on contract, even if we see a smaller crop, but still not as valuable as those sort of crops of 2017. They're getting on for a £1 billion pound crop. This is crop in the ground. This isn't the value of potatoes sold at retail or through processing or whatever. This is actually crop in the ground. That's that value. So you're seeing really and if you take inflation into account, then of course you're seeing an erosion of the value of the UK potato value. Just looking at some of the consumption figures. We've got potato consumption figures. These are, again, from DEFRA from 2022. And we're seeing a sort of gradual decline there in potato usage. Potato consumption did fall in 2022, as we see there. There was higher prices. These 2020, 2021, affected by COVID, people eating more at home and things. So these don't include the eating out figures. So you have seen a sort of decline or to back. So that consumption is less than it was pre-COVID levels, which I think is a concern for us. So we have seen a reduction in production, but we've also seen a reduction in consumption as well. But we still eat an awful lot of potatoes. Where do those potatoes come from? They're not coming from the UK. So obviously coming from somewhere else. And I think this is quite an astounding figure. There's two figures here. The blue line is actually the main exporters from the EU sending their frozen fries. This is frozen fries to the UK, and then the other orange lines are UK import figures. But either way, you are seeing an enormous thing. So more than around about 820,000 tonnes of frozen product coming into the UK. So the equivalent of getting on, even in that terms, about 1.7 million tonnes of potato equivalent coming mainly from Belgium and Netherlands into the UK as being their most important market and the second most important import market after the US. The US imports around about 1.3, 1.4 million tonnes of frozen fries, but we're second on the list to them. So that's there were some sort of anomalies with Brexit. What a surprise! There was but I think these figures are actually more accurate now, because what we saw was there was quite a jump after real Brexit. After the customs union single market finished, there was quite a jump in the imports then, but both figures are now saying around more than 800,000 tonnes of frozen product being imported every year, which is an enormous amount. This is UK self-sufficiency in potatoes. This is another DEFRA figures, and me again looking at those figures. So it had gone down to around about 63%, and we're probably nudging down the sort of 60% in terms of our self-sufficiency. You go back, 20, 30 years, and we were well over 80%, over 90% at one point. Obviously, we can grow potatoes. We're one of the best places to grow potatoes anywhere. So you've seen that inevitably if you're seeing a drop in production, but we're also seeing population growing at 0.5% a year. Even if people are eating slightly less potatoes, you're going to see a reduction in our self-sufficiency. And so it's its lowest rate ever. So we're breaking records at the bottom end at the moment. So smallest crop, smallest area, smallest crop, smallest self-sufficiency as a potato industry. Good news is that Brits still love potatoes. We're one of the biggest eaters of potatoes across Europe. You probably have to go into Eastern Europe to get people eating more potatoes. And we eat them in lots of different forms, and probably in some ways more different forms than anyone else, with roast potatoes being a favourite, which aren't that popular in other countries, which I always find extraordinary. And us as big crisp eaters. Although actually in America, they eat more in a retail space, they eat more crisps by potato weight volume than they do any other fresh potatoes or processed potatoes. They eat a lot of processed potatoes outside the home, but in the home they'll eat more crisps than any other potatoes. So we're sort of vying with America as the world's best chips or crisps eaters. We all know our reasons to love potatoes. Whole range of reasons there. This is Miss Tata, who is from the Portuguese Potato Association. She's their mascot, goes around to supermarkets and things like that selling potatoes. But I think, if you see it as a wonder crop, it is an extraordinary. I always think if you found potatoes now in the Andes, you would see it as the ultimate super crop. We talk about other sort of super crops, but there's nothing else quite like it. We sort of see it as like a mini food processor under the ground, absorbing all the goodness of the soil and all the minerals and things like that. But in terms of everything else, it does as well. Actually, from its environmental point of view, it's very, very good in terms of delivering energy, calories in because of its energy efficiency and because of its yield, and it scores as high or other crops and a whole load of things, even on protein, it scores pretty highly because of its yield attributes. So we all love potatoes. I think if you say to anyone you're in the potato industry, people are actually really interested in it, and they've all got their favourite way of eating potatoes. So, from that point of view, and actually if you go back to those consumption figures, we are still eating more potatoes than we are bread, and certainly more rice and pastas. They've made inroads into that. And one of the things, just looking at consumption, this is something that a campaign that Euorpatat has been coordinating and involved with, and Ireland, in the form of Bord Beer, are very much a part of that. And Lorcan is here, and Lorcan is the in charge of that for Bord Beer, but also the French Potato Association, CNIPT in France, and Vlam in Belgium. They've all come together. They've used some of their own money. They've obviously got some EU money, and that has seen some significant increases in certainly consumption, but also perception of potatoes. Would that be right? I've got some nodding. I've got a nodding Irish head and a nodding Spanish head, but a Spanish head who lives in Brussels. So, and this is some of the figures there we've got in terms of. So you're sort of seeing holding steady. If you look there, those are the COVID years. So you've seen a sort of return and a sort of holding steady of consumption. Sales in Ireland have been really strong, and that's having that sort of perception of being a food that's exciting to eat. Obviously, a traditional potato growing nation, but seeing some of that being taken away by other things like pasta and rice. But it's really sort of fighting back. And again, similar in France, there is still sort of strong following for potatoes there. So those sort of campaigns are working. I suppose whether we can have those sort of campaigns quite so easily in the UK now with the demise of the AHTB and without the EU money. But I know GB potatoes are certainly something that they will be looking at, and I know they're speaking tomorrow, so it's worth seeing them tomorrow as well. So lots of issues and discussion points, questions. So is declining potato self-sufficient? Is that an issue? Could that actually be good news for the people left in growing potatoes? The last thing you want is an oversupply of potatoes. So actually, as potato industry people, or potato growers in particular, is that good? If you've got fewer people competing with, is there room for another processing plant in the UK? Those import figures would suggest there is, because that's an awful lot of, if you had a UK processing plant making some of that. Actually, some of the exporters to the UK might like that, because it would give them an opportunity to export to other parts of the world where the market is growing. On the context, the world market has grown for frozen fries has grown about 5% over the last year, and by value it's grown by more than 30%. So there is enormous, massive demand for frozen potatoes and potato products around the world. And it's a really strong business to be in from that point of view. And sustainability of potatoes, of course, that's important, and the environmental impact of potatoes and the resilience. We've seen that this year. It's such an important thing. And one of the things we're just going to have a quick chat about in our discussion is a sort of resolution to the UK seed trade ban. And this is just some figures on import-export figures that we have. Some of these do get contested a little bit, but in some ways I think these are the best sort of figures that we have got. These are UK exports. So we've done better this last year, but we saw a reduction after Brexit. So we normally it was up to about 30,000 tonnes of UK seed went into the UK. Some EU seed is getting into the UK, but that's on a farmer-to-farmer basis. And I think for a lot of people that's good for people who can access that. But perhaps from the seed trade point of view, I know there's questions about that. And you think, well, if it's coming from farm to farm, why can't it come through a trader as well? And I think there is an appetite on both the UK side and the EU side to solve this. But it's something we'll speak about as in the next moment or two. So if I can ask both Gerard and Romans to come up, and that's probably our first question is, just make sure our microphones work. Whoop, and I'm not going to crash everything over. So the first question, Romans, you've been over here last couple of days. You've been, can you hear that okay, everyone? Thanks. And so you've been over for the last couple of days. What have you been doing, and what sort of reception have you had?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting us to speak here.
You're most welcome.
That's very appreciated. And yes, as you mentioned, that Bert and I, we are both from Euorpatat. The whole Euorpatat team is here. It's just two of us. We came first of all to Edinburgh to meet with SASA colleagues, and we met also with NFU Scotland, with Martin, with the president of NFU. And it was actually, we were pleased to see that there is still support, of course, and interest to restore bilateral trade. From our side, we also came to say that at the moment we are, of course, discussing this topic regularly at Euorpatat level. And what we see that from European traders' point of view, we also want to have a restored bilateral trade to some degree, and maybe in a different shape and form, but still we want to trade both, have a trade. And maybe also just wanted to add that we've been working quite hard on this topic since the beginning, since Brexit. And I started Euorpatat in October 2020, and it was basically Brexit was the #1 topic I started working on. And after the Brexit, when we find out that we will not be able to trade freely with sweet potatoes, I've been approached by BPTA almost like on the 3rd of January, and they said we need to contact the Commission and we need to push on them at least to have some kind of a temporary restoration of the trade, because no trade is not a good option. And we wrote a letter, and also we mobilized other trader stations like seed potato breeders, Euroseeds and farmers. We co-signed a common paper as well, and we sent it to the Commission. And we received replies from the favorite man, the most famous man in Scotland, in Van Gotham. I mean, everyone knows him. We don't meet him very often, but here everyone mentions his name, and I think some people even have his portrait probably here somewhere hanging in their offices. That's why for us it's kind of interesting to hear his name quite often here. And unfortunately, the reply was really, let's say, disappointing. Not only disappointing, like because they said no, but it also looked like a copy and paste from the legislation that basically UK needs to come into dynamic alignment if they want to export their seed potatoes to Europe. And of course, we didn't stop, because we saw that the politicians in the parliament got involved into this discussion, and they started hold different hearings on the impact of Brexit. And we approached the parliament and we said that, okay, maybe other industries affected a lot on the trade, and maybe some of them are struggling with the documents. For seed potato, when the 1st of January arrived, import of seed potatoes from the UK has stopped, and full stop. And when we mentioned this to politicians in the parliament, it's actually got their interest. And that's why we were lucky, they organized a special hearing in the parliament, and where we were able to present our point of view, our arguments, and we were absolutely pleased with the outcome of the hearing, because first of all, we had almost all members of the parliament supporting us, and it was really good. And they also invited a technical expert from the Walloon Research Center who supported that there's no reason not to allow import of seed potatoes to the UK, and actually it gave us a good push to continue working on this file.
And you're carrying on that
Absolutely.
push both sides of the
Absolutely.
of the North Sea.
And of course, thanks to BPTA, because there was enormous support from our member, Gerard and Sandy. They've been really pushing, providing the data. And
and from your point of view, Gerard, where do you think we are at the moment? Are we making progress?
It's what a lot of people don't seem to realise is that the seed potatoes are controlled by lots of different pieces of legislation, primarily plant health and phytosanitary legislation, and also seed potato marketing legislation, and also official controls legislation. And often these start to get rather complicated and have implications not only for seed potatoes, but if you make changes with one, that potentially sets precedents elsewhere. So it's a battle that, well, Roman's, he started in 2020. I've been doing this role since 2020 and spending an awful lot of time on trying to look for chinks in the armour, look for quirks in the legislation to try and find ways in which we can open up the trade, freedom of marketing again.
And I suppose so the support from the industry is important. So farmers supporting that and others is really important.
Just wanted to add, we had many discussions here, and as I said, there's a lot of support to restore bilateral trade to some degree, or full, depends on how it will be, or what will be the outcome. But we feel that there's a kind of a light in the end of the tunnel. I don't want to give everyone a false hope, but we feel that there's a light in the end of the tunnel because there will be elections in the in the EU. We will have a new parliament, a new commission. Who knows who will be the leader who will be the president of the commission next year? Also, you will have elections in the UK, and because we already see that the dialogue between both sides is changing, because now we have an agreement on Horizon, and we have an agreement on other aspects, and hopefully maybe there will be some senses, and also Windsor framework. I think it's a good kind of stimulus for us to keep moving.
A blueprint for it, yeah. Well, let's move on to consumption figures first. We'll quickly look at consumption. You've had that campaign, Euorpatat have been helping to organise that. That's delivering real benefits.
Well, I hope so, because it's Berta who is managing the dossier. Maybe we should give the floor to Berta.
Perhaps I should, and then I'll come down and I'll ask questions. So you can ask questions. I'll have the roaming mic, and then let's just ask Berta in terms of. So you've been organising that campaign for extra consumption, which is focused on millennials. Which you are a millennial, so that helps.
Thank you. Okay, so hi everyone. So yeah, I mean, we together with Borbia in Ireland, Sanipete in France, and Vlam in Belgium, I think it was 5 years ago that we sat together and we said, okay, we need to do something because we've seen that in all countries, and these 3 countries, the consumption of potatoes was declining. In other countries, I mean, we follow what is happening in 20 countries in Europe. And luckily, we can have access to some EU funding. So the European Commission is giving the opportunity to promote the consumption of potatoes, giving us 80% of public funding, let's say, and then the partners will still need to put 20% of it. And I mean, Orkan can also maybe give also the experience in Ireland, which is because for us as Euorpatat, what we have done is, helping to further disseminate all the actions that we were doing in other countries, for example, in Spain, in Italy, in Germany, or in Poland. And the idea of this campaign is to change, of course, is to stop the declining in consumption, but it's also to change the vision how millennials, how young people see potatoes potatoes. I don't know here in the UK, but for example, I know that in Ireland you made some studies and young people were looking at potatoes as something boring, something that it was cooked by grandmas, and it's not something that you can take a picture and put on your Instagram because it's not very fancy and cool. So I think that's also one of the main objectives of the campaign, is just to change that, and also to teach young people, about the versatility of potatoes. That you put for, let's say, kind of cooking of potatoes, but there are way more. So actually, in this campaign, what we have been doing in the first 3 years, we have put together 300 potato recipes. 300 potato recipes are a lot of potato recipes, just to show in how many ways you can cook potatoes. And now also we're focusing this year also on cooking tips, because also potatoes are seen as they take long time to cook, and we all know that we are busy lifestyles and we don't have a lot of time to spend at the kitchen. So yeah, it's also about cut them in small pieces so they will cook faster. Yeah, so this kind of thing.
So it's a real campaign. And briefly, Lorcan, from your point of view, from your point of view, what sort of difference is that making?
Well, the story of potato promotion in Ireland goes way back. I think we had a very declining product. Back in 2010, 2012, I took over the category. Growers were going out of business. I was getting phone calls. There was a realisation something needed to be done. So we're now on our third EU-sponsored campaign. And actually the very first EU campaign, which was the one which I would say lifted the volume back to its normality, was the one we did with AHDB potatoes. We did 2015 to 2018. And we put together the potato campaign at that time, and it raised volume by 30%. One thing, just getting back to the backdrop of all of this, in Ireland everybody thinks everybody eats potatoes. I know it's a cliche, but it's not the reality of it. The reality of it is it's competing with all the modern carbs. As part of that campaign that we actually did with AHEB potatoes, we found that when we looked at consumers in Dublin, London and Newcastle, the consumers in Dublin and London were closer in their thought process and attitudes and how they eat and consume than the people in Newcastle. So there was this huge image issue. For those of you on social media, I think it's summed up best by the fact when we did millennial research in Ireland, we found that millennials would not put a potato dish up on their Instagram feed. They wouldn't. They put their pasta, they put rice or whatever. I always go back to one of the earlier conferences, and I saw that Portuguese notice there today, all the benefits of potatoes. There is no point having the best or growing the best potatoes in the world if you don't tell the consumer what the benefits of it, or they'll move on to something else, So anyway, we did the first campaign. We raised it by 30% in volume terms. We got it to a steady, I think you showed 210,000 tonnes. We got a huge lift for COVID, and we're back down sort of where we are now. But when we went on, the first campaign was so successful, we decided to do a second one and even a third campaign. But the second campaign was oriented very, very differently, because what we're really trying to get at the moment in our first and second campaign with our European partners in France and in Belgium is we're trying to get at the millennials, that 20-something cohort, who at that key point in their lives, they make decisions around what food they're going to eat, and they quite easily can slip into their middle age and into raising families and only survive on pasta and rice. So we're trying to get potatoes onto that repertoire of meals through the campaign that was outlined around really inspiration, aspiration around potatoes, changing that image from traditional, my granny's cooking, over to modern, contemporary. Bag of potatoes in the home it's a meal at any time of the day or week.
Excellent, thanks for that. So we should have, rather than TikTok, we should, I don't know, chip chop or whatever. So questions to any of us. Who's got the first question? There's one there. Whoops, sorry.
It's not really a question, it's more of a statement. I work for the Scottish Government, and it's just maybe to give another side to the coin to the sort of previous discussion really about sort of, you know, trying to re-establish sort of reciprocal trade with the European Union. Through our colleagues in DEFRA, really, sort of, they have been pressing really hard, really, sort of, with the Commission, really, and to maintain this item, really, sort of, on the agenda, so that the technical cooperation agreement sort of has a specialist sort of committee that meets sort of on an annual basis, really, and the issue with seed potatoes has been a constant agenda item, really, to try and get it on. So I wouldn't like anybody in the audience to think that the government's been sitting on its hands, really, on this one, that they are pushing very hard, that we have sort of been pressing the sort of Commission for its risk assessment in terms of why they would not accept sort of seed potatoes, really, from GB, and it is something that we will continue to do. Okay.
Thanks, and I suppose it doesn't help. It doesn't harm for the potato industry, for potato growers to feed into that committee and tell them the impact it's having on the ground.
Absolutely, there has to be some sort of push and pull for the industry to add their voice to this campaign.
Yeah,
it's absolutely vital.
Brilliant. Thank you. Questions. Any other questions we've got? In terms of sort of self-sufficient, who thinks that self-sufficiency? Who's concerned about UK's potato self-sufficiency, and if they are, I'm going to ask you a question. But what can be done? What can be done about it? Because I suppose we don't want to oversupply the industry.
I don't know. I'm just a farmer.
So I suppose because we are consuming an awful lot. The idea of having another processing plant, we are consuming perhaps more processed product. So the idea of having another processing plant is one that would probably have to come from. That wouldn't come from a UK company. That would come perhaps from a European, a Dutch, a Belgian company, or even like we've got McCain's or Lamb Weston and North American companies. So any other questions? There's one right at the back, Ian.
So Cedric, I'm a scientist working at the James Hutton Institute, and every time I tell people that I'm a scientist working on potato, they laugh and say, how can you spend your whole career working on potato, as if potato's nothing? That people completely don't understand the importance of it on a worldwide scale, let alone a UK scale. And I think the work that we've just heard about trying to promote potatoes to younger people is so important, so that they appreciate that it's not just an interesting food. It's important for them to know it, but it's much more than that. It's a staple food. And if we start dropping below 50, 40% with a major staple food, we could find ourselves in trouble in the future. And we really don't want that to happen. So marketing, getting the message across is just so important.
I think it sort of raises quite a lot of questions in terms of our own food self-sufficiency for everything. And actually there's more and more demands on our land for other uses, environmental, quite rightly, environmental uses, carbon, renewables and all those sort of things. But you can only do a certain amount with the land you've got, and going down with our food production, especially those sort of crops. We are one of the best places, geographically suited to growing potatoes, aren't we? So it's one of those. It's not bananas. It's one of those sort of crops that we can grow here. You say about people say you're a potato scientist. When I say I'm a potato journalist, people really laugh. Then how can you write about potatoes all the time? A question down here.
One of the limiting factors, I think, for the production of potatoes in England is probably the PCN problem and the build-up of it, because we've lost all our chemicals, and most of them. And the only way of getting around the problem to keep the yields up is to find clean land, which is becoming more and more difficult.
And I suppose that's a question that's mirrored in other parts of certainly in Europe as well. We're seeing that in the Netherlands, perhaps even more in the Netherlands here. They've really got to peak potatoes, and they're beyond peak potato going down. The same now happening in Belgium as well. So this is a major issue. And I suppose it is getting those farmers to grow potatoes when perhaps they don't want to take the risk of growing. Those farmers who are renting out their land to grow potatoes don't want to take the risk, and they want to grow other crops. Or, now with elm schemes and all those sort of things, even more options for them to do. Other questions? Here's one here.
when you talk about self-sufficiency, my question would be, of what we're importing, is it low-value processed product or is it high-value? So is it something that we really ought to replace because there's a good margin in it, or is it low-value stuff coming in at the bottom end of the market that's very difficult to compete on cost of production?
Yeah, I suppose, I mean, traditionally, Belgium has had a lower cost of production and Netherlands perhaps a lower cost of production here. I think, well, apart from this year, they've got much higher contract prices and things, so some of that is changing. And I think a lot of that is what's imported will be used in restaurants. Really, if you go to any restaurant that isn't a fish and chip shop, and you're eating chips, fries, they are going to be imported. Because that's for the sort of catering industry. I suppose it's getting the balance right. I don't know, from Gerard, from your point of view, what do you think about sort of self-sufficiency? Is it something that you and your members are concerned about in terms of potatoes? And if so, what can be done?
Certainly, membership's concerned because obviously it's impacts upon the trade as well. To me, there's a huge yawning gap there within the UK. From a food security point of view, you look back through history, there's been several times the UK has gone down the route of importing food and then been caught out for one reason or another. I mean, we saw it recently with Putin invading Ukraine and spiking prices, and all of a sudden, things start getting short. The unintended consequence of that was tomatoes became short on the shelves. Nothing to do with tomatoes coming from Ukraine, but because of the spike in gas prices, growers stopped growing tomatoes, and the production from elsewhere around the world all of a sudden dried up. So potentially the same thing could happen with potatoes going forward. There's a lot of threats to the as growers amongst the audience will more than agree, I would think, is the risk versus reward is getting more and more challenging, and other options are out there now with the various environmental schemes. One could argue as to whether they're sufficient as yet, but land is becoming less available as a result of that, and also, as the gentleman in the front said, as a result of PCN and various other problems, and a loss of pesticides is increasing the risk of potato production, and therefore the risk versus reward is getting less, is getting more problematic. So, but it has the potential of leaving the country short of potatoes. So I think it'll sooner or later we will see problems, I think.
Romans, you've got a comment on
Yeah, I just wanted to add as well regarding plant protection products and their availability. I mean, from European perspective, it's really getting harder and harder because now this week there's a vote in the European Parliament where they are voting on the draft legislation which will implement the target which was set by the Commission to reduce the use of pesticides by 50%. And it's kind of really big burden because we've been already losing substances due to the lack of, because they don't meet certain criteria, reauthorization criteria, and we have a small pool of substances, and we'll have to slash half of them, and that's why it will be challenging, even more challenging in the future to have good substances to fight certain diseases. Yeah.
I suppose that is actually something that the UK is outside that now, but where the EU leads, UK often follows, and you can't be too out of kilter the two systems.
You might call yourself lucky, but we will see how things will work out in future.
We're trying to find some Brexit benefits, and a question from even further away, from Ryan.
Hi there. I guess piggybacking on what you just said, do your governments see how seriously do they take self-sufficiency of food? Because if they're continuing to get rid of crop protection products and make it harder for you to farm, make it for growers to farm, do they see it as a priority and there's a disconnect between those two things, or is it more on the back burner and they'll worry about it when there's not food on the shelves?
That depends upon which politicians you talk to, basically. Some yes, some no, wherever it's cheap. The prime thing, in my opinion, that government's been interested in of late has been getting inflation down. So if they can import it cheaper to keep a lid on inflation, they've been more than happy to let imports come in. And we've seen that with the constant kicking down the road of the target operation model, which is the border control legislation that have been bringing in. So,
and Roman, in terms of Brussels, how important do they regard food security?
Oh, food security is, of course, it's a hot topic at the moment, especially now the climate change. And when the Ukrainian war started, we were talking about food affordability because of the high gas prices and nitrate prices and fertilizer prices. And now, of course, now we are more talking about food security, and of course, because now we see, like as you mentioned, for example, regarding some of the crops which are still in soil. You mentioned that in Belgium it's estimated that 20% of potatoes are still in soil. Actually, I heard that a different number, which is 35%, and that's why we will see how it will we'll be able to kind of make sure that there's enough potatoes on the market.
So it should probably, an advantage for Prince Edward Island there, I think, right, in terms of competition.
Well, just as a follow-up, so we go down the same road with you, and usually if something gets banned in the EU or the UK, it's 5 to 10 years for it, it's coming out, getting phased out in Canada. But we did see the last few years, our Health Canada had put a lot of products, a lot of chemistries up for reevaluation, thought we were going to lose them, and then upon consultation with the industry, we've been able to save probably 2/3 to 3/4 of them, usually through label changes or updating the label, at least in terms of usage patterns and that sort of thing. And so we've been able to save mancozeb when they were going to take it off, and we were able to save chlorothalonil when they were going to take it off, and some of these products. So it's not saying we've got it figured out, because we sure don't, and Health Canada is still challenging to deal with, but I think there's an understanding, there's starting to be a little more understanding at home in terms of we can't get rid of every chemistry or we won't have agriculture. So even with a fairly activist government. So I think, it'd be interesting to see what will push governments to the point where that becomes more of a priority of being more domestically self-secure in food production. Thanks.
Thanks very much. I know we've got a question here, and this is a potato student. We've got a question here from Jordan.
It's just, there's research into, imports being a diversification of supply into different countries, and whether or not it's about keeping the balance between having enough imports that if something does go terribly wrong, that you can still feed your nation whilst also supporting your domestic farmers, because ultimately they're also the ones feeding the nation. So how do you think is best to find this balance between the two?
Who wants to take that? And Gerard, do you want to have
I slightly missed it. What was the point of the question? The balance between importing and self-sustainability?
Yeah, so having a sort of enough balance, so there's a bit in the larder, if you like, in terms of there's always enough there to a bit of slack is.
Well, the question is what is the percentage of self-sufficiency versus import to keep such that you keep the balance right between having that flexibility such that you don't oversupply within your own country, but you have the flexibility, you have enough produced in your own country so as you're not left short in the event of a global situation that stops you importing.
I think from my point of view, it's also quite important that actually we're losing self-sufficiency in other bits of agriculture as well. It's not just potatoes. So you could say, well, does it really matter if we're producing more something else, cereals, that we can actually carry on feeding ourselves. But if you look at all the figures, we're probably, and I think this year, 2023, we probably produced the least amount of calories in terms of UK agriculture for a very long time. So I know sort of governments look at it and they'll say something and say it's important to do it, but I think that needs a part of a sort of food policy, if you like, to take it more seriously. And I suppose with an election coming up, that's for the food industry and the farming industry to be part of that debate and to stress it. I think we've got time to just one more question. Here we are.
It's actually not a question. It's more and more sort of a follow-up point, and I think that's the power of the retailers as well. You know, where we are working in global supply chains, and if the cost of production in the UK is too high, then we're seeing evidence of UK retailers going elsewhere for the product, whether that be in blueberries or whether that be in egg production. You know, so we have to remember there's a factor in there, and that is the retailer that hold a significant influence on the supply chain.
So it is about our cost of production, which I suppose is land. It's a whole load of things, isn't it? Although Netherlands has got much higher land prices than us, so it's a complex thing. Thank you very much for your questions and your participation. Thanks very much to Romans and to Gerard. We are here if you want to have a chat with us, and hope you enjoy the rest of the show. Thank you.